how is it as an archaeologist that you get interested in something like studying ghosts since they're not leaving artifacts behind for you to dig up in the ground? Like, how does that work out?
Hey, Billy, that's a great question. Again, thanks for having me on again, man. And this is a fascinating topic. I mean, it's obviously in the pop culture. There's all kinds of movies. People are really obsessed with the supernatural, and there's all kinds of movies about this, and podcasts and books. And another thing in our culture is people's fascination with UAPs and UFOs and things like that. But as far as ghosts, my first interest actually started quite a few years ago. I was I don't know, I think I may have been a seminary student, and I actually found a book by a Christian archaeologist, actually, that taught at Old Testament at Dallas Theological Seminary years ago. His name is Dr. Merrill Unger, Unger. And the title of the book was, I believe it was called Demonology. And that was the title of the book, Demonology, and it was a history of demons in the Bible. And I think you can still get copies of it. But what fascinated me about the book, Billy, is that when I opened it up and started looking through it, it had a ton of archaeology in it, and there was a lot of archaeological things that he was citing in the book in relationship to demons in the Old Testament and the ancient world. And then recently, so that got me started on the being interested in the topic of demons and ghosts and the afterlife in the ancient world. And then several years ago, I was introduced to the work of a British Assyriologist at the British Museum named Dr. Irving Finkel. And when I started really reading Finkel was really in my interest in my research of the whole Noah's Ark story and the historical artifacts and geography associated with the landing of the Ark. He actually wrote a book called The Ark Before Noah, and so I had that book, and then I saw that he wrote another book on ghosts, and so knowing Dr. Finkel's excellent scholarship, I thought this has got to be a great book, and it really, really is. And a book about ghosts. And so the question is, how in the world? And this is the question that I had too. Is when I first saw Finkel's book on it, I thought, well, I wonder how he's going to do this, because there's a lot of there are some historical inscriptions about demons and stuff, but how do you study ghosts through archaeology? Well, as it turns out, you can't study the afterlife or the supernatural through artifacts, because archaeology is a study of artifacts. It's a study of things that people leave behind. So pottery, buildings like that. But there are historical inscriptions, and there are statues and certain things that people have made that help us to understand what people believed about the supernatural world. So these things do point to a very strong belief in the spiritual world from humans at the very, very earliest beginning of time. In fact, in his book, Finkel says that we can actually point to the very first word for ghost on a clay tablet, a cuneiform tablet, from near the beginning of the third millennium BC, some about 5,000 years ago. There was the Sumerian word for ghost. And then in the beginning of the book, he also sort of lays out archaeologically what we can infer through the archaeology of people, of the earliest humans, at least that we find in the archaeological record, and their belief in some sort of afterlife, which is interesting, and we can unpack this here in a minute. But let me just list a few here, Billy. One of the earliest, and this is debated among Christians. Christian scholars debate this, but I'm just going to throw it out there. So the question is whether or not Neanderthals were actually related to humans. And I think one of the things that hinges on that is, do we find human culture in Neanderthal archaeology? In fact, there was a cave in northern Iraq in a place called, we call it sort of in the regional areas called Iraqi Kurdistan. And this place is called Shanidar Cave. And there, several years ago, there was discovered a Neanderthal burial there, and it looked like there were flowers in the grave with the Neanderthals. And that the significance of that is that it looked like the Neanderthals were putting flowers on the grave deliberately. Now, the debate is in sort of the controversy, not the controversy, but you got two people on either side, that the flowers actually, or the pollen actually came in through a burial of or a boring of a rodent later. And then some people still think that no, Neanderthals were actually putting flowers on graves. But then later, we'll say that there were discovered other Neanderthal burials that were deliberate, which seems to indicate in the very, very earliest human levels, humans believed in some sort of afterlife, or at least they had a respect for the dead. And then, even if you don't take the Neanderthal as being evidence of belief in the afterlife, in the Upper Paleolithic, this is a time period that Finkel talks about as well. He kind of goes over this in the beginning of the book. So just for people's understanding of the Paleolithic is about, no, again, I don't want to debate age of the earth and all that, but according to traditional dating that archaeologists give, the Upper Paleolithic dates to around 50,000 years ago, show that burial grave goods in burials were actually really commonplace. So again, no matter what date you put on the Upper Paleolithic, it shows that the very earliest humans are actually burying people, they're dead, with grave goods, and indicating that there's some sort of at least belief in the afterlife. And then, of course, we get into the historical period, and one of the earliest myths in Mesopotamia is the Epic of Gilgamesh. And people may or may not be familiar with the Epic of Gilgamesh, but to make a long story short, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh is the king of Uruk, and he becomes friends with this sort of crazy wild man named Enkidu. That's his name, Enkidu, spelled with an E, Enkidu. And Enkidu is actually killed in the city of Uruk. There is this bull that was created by the goddess Inanna, or Ishtar, because Gilgamesh refused to go with Ishtar. So she was a spurned lover. So she sent the bull of heaven down to Uruk to fight Gilgamesh and Enkidu. So Enkidu's killed, and what's interesting about the Epic of Gilgamesh, Billy, is that people read that story in grade school, but it actually contains some really profound philosophical questions. And this is the very earliest historical things that we have. And when Enkidu dies, when he's killed by the bull of heaven, Gilgamesh completely has a 180. Before Enkidu's death, he's this crazy madman. He's killing everybody and taking everybody's wife, literally. And then after the death of Enkidu, he gets very contemplative, and he begins to think about the afterlife, and and the question that burns in Gilgamesh's mind is, can a man live forever, or are we just mortal? And so then Gilgamesh goes on this journey. Get this, he goes on a journey because he remembers that there is a man who's still alive. He was alive before the flood. In fact, he survived the flood, and his name was Utnapishtim in the Gilgamesh epic. Now, we know the same story in the Bible in Genesis 6 through 10, or Genesis 6 through 9, of the flood narrative, and that's Noah. It's the same exact character. So Gilgamesh goes to this far-off mountain, and he meets with Utnapishtim, because he's trying to figure out, can he live forever? And Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh that there is a plant, get this, that if you eat this plant, it's called the plant of the Shabti, I think it's spelled Shabti. It's a Sumerian word, and it means plant of the heartbeat. So that sounds very familiar to the tree of life, the tree of the knowledge of good, or the tree of life, rather, in the Garden of Eden. So Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh about this plant, and he tells him where to get it. And incidentally, the plant is in the bottom of the ocean, so Gilgamesh has to put bricks on his feet and go dive down to the bottom of the ocean to get it, because obviously it was lost in the flood. So Gilgamesh gets the plant, he brings it back on the surface, and then a sea snake takes the plant back down on the bottom of the ocean. So he can't live forever. He's going to die.
Sea snakes,
so
man.
that's I know, you got to watch out for the sea snake. So So that's a whole long story of how this very complex understanding of death. And then another myth that came up. This is a very early myth in Mesopotamia. Is There's a Mesopotamian goddess by the name of Inanna. She's also known as Ishtar. She is the goddess of war and love, and she descends into the underworld. And then, of course, many people are familiar with ancient Egypt and the Egyptian concept of the afterlife. And one of the most important myths in Egypt is called the myth of Osiris. And the myth of Osiris, basically, that myth, and this is in the book, The First Ghost. He gets into this a little bit. Finkel does, although not. He doesn't develop it as much. He mainly focuses his attention on Mesopotamia. But I think it's good to bring up the myth of Osiris, because in the myth of Osiris in ancient Egypt, Osiris, of course, is this great king, and he has a brother named Seth, who actually is very jealous of him. He murders his brother and chops his body up and cuts his body up and spreads it all around the earth. Osiris's wife, Isis, actually, because she knows magic, she actually collects the body parts and she patches them back together with linen cloths. So what does that sound like? It sounds like mummification. And in fact, that's exactly. So she puts, with her magic, she brings Osiris back from the dead. And of course, they have a son named Horus, and everybody knows who Horus is. He's the falcon-headed god, and he is the god of kingship. So Osiris, now that he's put back together as a mummy, he can actually, if he wanted to, in fact, he was offered to come back and rule on earth as the Pharaoh of Egypt. But he says, no, I'm gonna rule in the afterlife, and I'm gonna be the main god in the underworld, and my son is going to be the ruler of all the kings of Egypt. So that's why Horus is considered to be connected with kingship and the Pharaoh in the Egyptian pantheon. And then, of course, since we're talking about the Old Testament, and we're talking about this very ancient, very early concept of the afterlife and things like this, in the book of Job, Job asks the question, when a man dies, shall he live again? And so what there seems to be, I think, Billy, is in these early Mesopotamian myths, and even in the book of Job, which is a very early book in the Old Testament, historically speaking, is that humans are haunted by the consequences and the results of the fall, and they long for eternal life. There's this burden of mortality. And so this is this whole idea of the longing for the eternal. And of course, as the writer of Ecclesiastes says, that God has planted eternity in the hearts of man. So those are a few things here as we sort of kind of open up the discussion about the afterlife. And I haven't really gotten into ghosts yet, but maybe we can do that next.